first session of day 2. So today we have the second session of day 2. So I welcome Professor Srinath from Triple IT Hyderabad. So thank you so much for giving your valuable time and joining us in this Atal FDP, sir. And I
Thank
hope
you.
the participants will enjoy your session. Now over to you, Srinath, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. So next 2 hours is for breaking the famous RSA algorithm using a polynomial time quantum algorithm, namely Shor's algorithm. It's a popular algorithm. So it's there around for multiple decades. So many of you may be aware. So we'll try and understand the algorithm discovered by Peter Shor, which is an efficient algorithm on a quantum computer for the problem of integer factorization, which of course will also help break RSA, because we know that if you can factorize the public key n into p and q such that p into q is equal to n, then p minus 1 into q minus 1 becomes the Euler quotient of n. And once you know the Euler quotient of n, modulo the Euler quotient of n, you can find the private key d given the public key e such that e into d is congruent to 1 mod phi of n. So all that we are not going to do. We are directly going to solve only the problem of integer factorization, because once you can factorize the public key, we know how to break RSA. So the entire 2-hour session is about one single very nice efficient quantum algorithm for the problem of integer factorization. So we know what is the problem of integer factorization. You will be given odd integer n and you need to find one non-trivial prime factor of it. Your integer n is actually composite. So if it is prime, you can do a probability testing to find out if it's prime or not. So given a composite integer n, which is odd, you need to find one prime factor of it. So that is the integer factorization problem. So the algorithm at a very high level consists of just 4 steps. So entire 2 hours is about understanding 4 steps. Not all of the 4 steps are equally uniformly complex, so we won't spend half an hour each. So for instance, first step is to reduce the problem of factoring to the problem of finding non-trivial square root of unity modulo n. So our original job task is to factorize n, the capital N. First step is we'll show that the problem of finding a factor of n can be reduced to the problem of finding non-trivial square root of 1 modulo n. We'll define what the problem is and give the reduction first. So the step 1 completes when we actually give the reduction and we say that now all that is left is to show an efficient algorithm which can find a non-trivial square root of 1 modulo n, because by the end of step 1 we would have already reduced factoring to this. Reducing problem A to problem B actually means giving an algorithm which uses the solution for B to solve A. So we'll use the solution for finding a non-trivial square root of 1 modulo n to factor n. So that is first step. So at the end of first step, all that will be left is, okay, how do you find the non-trivial square root of unity? So finding non-trivial square root of unity is as hard as factoring because of this reduction. So step 2 is we'll reduce the problem of finding the non-trivial square root of unity modulo n to another problem, and that problem is computing the order of a random integer modulo n. So we'll define what is order, we'll define this problem, and we'll give the reduction. So after the first 2 steps, the original problem of integer factorization would have been now reduced to the problem of computing the order of a random integer modulo n, because it's a 2-step reduction. So by now we know somehow if you can compute the order of a random integer modulo n, we would have actually solved the integer factorization problem of n. Of course, we didn't define what you mean by non-trivial square root. We didn't define what you mean by order. So all this, what the problem is part of the slides. So at this point, all we need is to find the order of a random integer modulo n. Till now, there is no quantum mechanics involved. And step 3 is how do you compute the order of a random integer n? So at this point, we'll start bringing in some quantum mechanics. We'll be able to show in step 3 that to compute the order of a random integer modulo n, you would be able to set up a quantum superposition which will have non-zero amplitudes in a periodic way such that the period of this periodic superposition is exactly the order of the integer that you are looking for, and therefore computing the order of the integer now reduces to, can you find the period of this periodic quantum superposition? And notice that step 4 is a method to actually compute period of a periodic superposition of a quantum state. You take the quantum Fourier transform of that and measure it and get multiple such values, and take the GCD and then take the inverse. That is, you will get n by the original period. So you have to do from n by r, you have to get r. So that is simple. So I'll repeat the 4 steps. So first step is from factoring, you go to finding non-trivial square root of 1. Second step is from finding non-trivial square root of 1, you go to the problem of order of a random integer. Third step is to get the order of a random integer, you should be able to get a quantum superposition that is periodic and its period is exactly equal to the order that you want. And fourth step is to, given a quantum periodic superposition, how do you get the period? Take a quantum Fourier transform and take the measurements multiple times, then take GCD, you will get n by r, from that you will get r. So that is the idea. So these are the 4 major steps. So we'll now spend time for each of these 4 steps, and entire algorithm can then be written down in a single shot towards the end. So let's begin the first step. Step 1. So original problem is finding a factor of n. This problem, that is finding factor of n, we are saying is in some sense equivalent to, or is no harder than the problem of finding non-trivial square root of 1, because we are going to give a reduction. And what is the reduction? Reduction follows from the following lemma. If x is a non-trivial square root of 1 modulo n, then GCD of x plus 1 and n is a non-trivial factor of n. Now, what do you mean by non-trivial square root of 1 modulo n? So x is said to be a non-trivial square root of 1 modulo n if x square is equal to 1 modulo n. That is, if x square is divided by n, the remainder should be 1, and it is a trivial square root if x is equal to 1 or minus 1. So you can, as you can see, if x is equal to 1, then 1 square is equal to 1, and therefore 1 is a square root of 1 modulo n. So that's a trivial square root. Similarly, minus 1, which is same as n minus 1. N minus 1 also is a trivial square root of 1 modulo n, because minus 1 square is also 1. And that's another trivial square root. So a non-trivial square root is, find an x which is neither 1 nor n minus 1, such that it is a number between 0 and n minus 1, which is neither 1 nor n minus 1, such that x square when divided by n gives a remainder 1. So that will be a non-trivial square root of 1 modulo n. If you are able to find such an x such that x square is congruent to 1 modulo n, then the lemma says then you can easily factor and get a non-trivial factor of n, because it tries to prove that the greatest common divisor between x plus 1 and n will be a non-trivial factor of n. So let us give a proof for this, and that will give us the reduction also. So x is a non-trivial square root of 1 modulo n. That means x square is congruent to 1 modulo n, which means n divides x square minus 1, because when x square is divided by n, remainder is 1. So n must exactly divide x square minus 1. Now n divides x square minus 1 means n also divides x plus 1 into x minus 1, because x square minus 1 is nothing but x plus 1 into x minus 1. Now x is not 1, x is not minus 1 means x plus 1 is not 0, and x minus 1 is not 0. So neither of this is 0, right? However, n divides the product. Now n divides 0, we know the product is not 0. So n divides this product means it is either n or 2n or 3n or some multiple of n. However, notice that x plus 1 is less than n, and x minus 1 is also less than n. So the product of two numbers less than n is divisible by n, right? Means that n cannot divide x plus 1, n cannot divide x minus 1, because it's a smaller numbers, but n divides their product. That means some prime factors of n are prime factors of x plus 1. The other rest of the prime factors of n are prime factors of x minus 1. So there is the prime factors of n are being distributed across x plus 1 and x minus 1, because n divides the product, but n does not divide x plus 1, n does not divide x minus 1 because they are smaller than n. Therefore, from fundamental theorem of arithmetic, there is a unique prime divisor for the prime factorization of n, and that is nothing but say x plus 1 into x minus 1 into some number is so n divides x plus 1 into x minus 1. So x plus 1 into x minus 1 is some multiple of n. So every prime factor of n should also divide x plus 1 into x minus 1. Not all prime factors of n divides x plus 1. Not all prime factors of n divides x minus 1, and therefore the prime factors of n are split across the board. That is quick to see because x is not 1, x is not minus 1. So x plus 1 is not 0, x minus 1 is not 0, both are not 0, and each of them is less than n, and therefore n cannot divide each of them, but n divides their product, means some factors, prime factors of n divides x plus 1, the rest of them divide x minus 1. Therefore, whatever is the prime factors that divide x plus 1 and n can be found out, because n must have a non-trivial factor common with x plus 1, and also the rest of the prime factors of n are common with x minus 1. Thus, if I take the GCD of x plus 1 and n, it must divide n by definition, and it will be non-trivial because it is a prime factor and n is odd, so we are not worried about 2, so it's at least 3. So you find that this is the proof. So for example, if you want to check it out using a particular example, say n is 15. Now, what is an example of a non-trivial square root modulo 15? So one example is 4, because 4 square when divided by 15 gives remainder 1. So 4 square is 16. 16 when divided by 15 gives remainder 1. Therefore, 4 is a non-trivial square root of 1 because it is not 1, not minus 1. So what are the trivial square roots of 1 modulo 15? 1 and 14. So 1 square is 1, 14 square will be 1 if we are modulo 15. So because minus 1, that is. So 1 and 14 are the trivial square roots modulo 15 for unity. There are non-trivial square roots too. For instance, 4 is a non-trivial square root. Why? Because 4 square is also congruent to 1 mod 15, but 4 is not 1 or minus 1. Now, what does the theorem say? Therefore, 4 plus 1, when you take GCD with 15, will give you a non-trivial factor. Even I could also done for x minus 1. So 4 minus 1 also will have, because the prime factors of n are distributed. Some of them are distributed with x plus 1 and some of them are with x minus 1. So GCD of x plus 1 and n will also give you a non-trivial factor. GCD of x minus 1 and n will also give another non-trivial factor. So since 4 is our x here, so we find that GCD of 4 minus 1 and 15 is a factor, that is 3 for 15, and GCD of 4 plus 1 and 15 is another factor. So you want to see, try this for 21, for say 187, for several other numbers, you will find that it will always work, because we have mathematical proof that if x is a non-trivial square root of unity modulo n, then the GCD of x plus 1 or x minus 1 and n is a non-trivial factor of n. Therefore, if you want to find the non-trivial factor of n, that's the original problem, it is sufficient to find an x such that x square when divided by n will give remainder 1. For instance, if you want to factor 15, it's sufficient to locate this 4, because 4 square modulo 15 is 1. So another non-trivial square root of unity modulo 15 will be 11. So 11 square is 121, mod 15 is 1. So 11 GCD of 11 minus 1 and 15 and GCD of 11 plus 1 15 will also work. So any non-trivial square root works. So the problem now has reduced to computing the non-trivial square root of unity modulo n. Now we use the word reduction because it's a technical word, it's a Karp reduction. However, in practical terms, all that we have done is we have just proved that if integer factorization is a very hard problem, then so should the problem of finding non-trivial square roots of unity modulo n, because if you can find non-trivial square root of 1, then you are able to factorize. If factorization is a hard problem, then now finding non-trivial square root of 1 also should be hard, and therefore all that we have accomplished so far is show that finding non-trivial square root of unity is also a hard problem. However, we are taking this route because, as we said, we'll keep showing that you can do further and further reductions, and at some point quantum mechanics will come and solve it, and that is our step 4. So let us see, move to step 2, because step 1 is complete. So we are no longer interested in the problem of integer factorization directly, because we know that all we need is to solve the problem of finding non-trivial square roots of unity mod n, and that will entail a solution for the integer factorization, which in turn will entail breaking RSA. So all that we are not going to be worried in the rest of the talk. Rest of the talk now is about the 3 steps, which will be to solve or find the non-trivial square root of unity, but then we'll reduce it further again. Step 2 says that to find the non-trivial square root of unity, it is sufficient to compute the order of a random number modulo n. So what do you mean by order of some random number x? Order of x modulo n is the smallest positive integer r, such that x power r when divided by n gives remainder 1. So x power r should be congruent to 1, and smallest such positive r is called the order of x. Now we can see some examples as we go along, but our job in step 2 is to notice that we can reduce the problem of finding the non-trivial square root of unity to the problem of computing the order of x, that is computing the smallest positive integer r, such that x power r is congruent to 1 mod n for a random x. So notice that we want to find square root of unity. Now we are just saying for some x. So our job is to find a x such that x square is congruent to 1 mod n. Find such an x, we say for some other x. So some y, or here we are using the same variable x. If you are able to find the smallest positive integer r such that x power r is congruent to 1, then we are saying you sort of got a reduction. It's a randomized reduction. We'll see why. To the problem of finding the non-trivial square root. Let us see why is that. So notice that if r, the order of some random x, turns out to be an even number, then we know that x power r is congruent to 1 mod n. X power r by 2, because r is even, r by 2 will be an integer. X power r by 2 will necessarily turn out to be a non-trivial square root of 1. Why? Because x power r by 2 whole square will be x power r, but x power r is 1, and therefore x power r by 2 has to be, or x power r by 2 mod n, that is, has to be a non-trivial square root of 1. Now what happens if r is odd? If r is odd, the reduction does not work. But therefore what we are saying is choose a random x and repeat the process till the r, that is the order, becomes even. And notice that there's about 50% chance of r being even, 50% chance of r being odd, around about that. Say people were able to prove in the case of this reduction that it is exactly half. We don't have the proof, but you can easily see that 50% of the excess will give you even order, 50% of excess will give you odd order. Therefore, if you choose a random x, the probability that the order r that you'll compute will be even is 50%. Therefore, if it is odd, you just repeat the whole process and repeat until it turns out that the random x that you chose has a even order. Now, if x is not co-prime to n, then notice that the order itself may not be well defined. So we assume that x is co-prime to n, and this is a very, very good assumption, because if you choose a random x and it turns out that GCD of x and n is not 1, then you already factored in. The job ends there. So you choose a random x and compute the GCD of x and n, more than likely you will find that it is GCD is 1, because if GCD is not 1, you already got a factor of n. So if GCD is 1, then x is co-prime to n, then notice that I can compute the order of x and see whether it is even, and if it is even, then I declare that x power r by 2 is a non-trivial square root of unity. So to see an example, again let us say n is 15 and let us say x is 2. You randomly chose 2. And I compute the order of 2. What is the order of 2? The smallest integer r is that 2 power r when divided by 15 gives remainder 1. it turns out that the smallest is 4. So 2 power 1 is 2, 2 power 2 is 4, 2 power 3 is 8, 2 power 4 is 16, 16 when divided 15 gives remainder 1. Therefore, the order of 2 is 4. Now 4 is even, and therefore 2 to the power 4 by 2, that is 2 to the power 2, should be a non-trivial square root of unity, because 2 to the power 4 is 1 mod 15. 2 to the power 2 whole square is 2 to the power 4. So 2 to the power 2 is a square root of unity, and therefore we see that we can get the GCD of this plus 1 or this minus 1 and 15, and that step we already saw. So factoring now is reduced to the problem of computing the order of a random integer x. And if I have a very fast algorithm to compute the order, I choose a random x, I compute the order. If it turns out to be odd, I repeat that again and again, and after fairly expected number of trials, which being 2. By the time you try 2 times one of them, you expect it to be even. And once you get an even order, you just compute x to the power r by 2 mod n, and computing x to the power r by 2 mod n is easy. So you can compute x, then x square, and then x power 4, and in logarithmic number of steps, you can compute x power r by 2 mod n. So with that, you can see that. So just a minute. Sorry. So that you can see that you have reduced the problem of integer factorization. So sorry for the interruption. You reduce the problem of integer factorization to the problem of computing the order of a random x. So we now move to step 3. So how do you compute the order of the random x? So till now there is no quantum mechanics, and till now there is in classical world not much progress also, because even if you knew all this, you only have sort of given conviction that the problem of computing the order of a random integer x modulo n is a hard problem, because if you can solve it, you can do integer factorization. We expect that integer factorization does not have an efficient algorithm, and therefore we continue to expect that there is no way an efficient algorithm can give us the order of a random integer modulo n. And because if you have an efficient algorithm for that, you actually can have an efficient algorithm for factoring also. However, there is an efficient quantum algorithm to find the order of a random integer modulo n, and that is what we are going to see. So that is our step 3 and 4. How do you compute the order of a random integer x modulo n? So what is the order? Order is the smallest integer r such that x power r when divided by n will give remainder 1. That's all. Okay. Now, how do we plan to do that? So we plan to use quantum mechanics. So for which we need to know some minimum quantum mechanics to see how to proceed. So we'll take a detour. So before we take the detour, to understand why quantum superposition is useful here, and how do you proceed to do the quantum Fourier transform to actually compute the order and all that. Look at that the problem of computing the order of random integer modulo n itself can be posed as computing the period of a periodic function. So that is our first. So we can actually write some periodic function whose period. So periodic function is a function that is going to give same answer for inputs x plus r, x plus 2r, and if the inputs are in that arithmetic progression, the output is the same. That is a periodic function. Now what we want to say here is, original problem is to compute the order of a random integer modulo n, order of x modulo n. That problem of computing the order of x modulo n can be posed as computing the period of some periodic function. So let us do that conversion. So how do you do that? So I'll directly give the function. So let the function be f of a, where f of a is x power a mod n. Notice that this function f is a periodic function, and the period of this function is exactly the order of x. So let us see why. So we have f of 0 is x power 0 mod n. That is 1. F of r is x power r mod n. That is also 1. f of 2r is x power 2r, that is x power r whole power 2, x power r is 1, so x power 2r is also 1. So f of 0, f of r, f of 2r, f of 3r, f of 4r, all of them will be the same, and therefore we see that f of a in general will be f of a plus r, because f of a is x power a mod n, f of a plus r is f of x power a plus r, x power a plus r is x power a into x power r, x power r is 1, and therefore that will be x power a. So you can quickly see that f is a periodic function with some period r, and that period r is exactly the order of x, and therefore the problem, instead of stating compute the order of x modulo n, could also be stated as compute the period of this function f. So we'll now worry only about computing the period of this function f. We'll not worry about that much about computing order of x, because it is one and the same. So how do you compute period of this periodic function? So if you give me say values of a and value at a plus r, then I know that I can get the period.
The model statement defined the use of non-local band-to-band tunneling model with the tunneling direction.
Hello. Okay. Right. So now the problem is only to find the period of a periodic function. Now in the classical world, how do you find the period? So you may compute f at various values and look for, say I compute f of 0, then f of 1, then f of 2, f of 3, f of 4, and keep computing this, and see whether f of 0 is 1, see whether f of some r is 1, and the smallest is r, I got the period. So if I know, given that I know that it's periodic, I can evaluate the function at several points and look for repetition and get the period. But notice that the period could be very large. For instance, in RSA case, n is a 1024-bit number, and if I choose an x, the period itself could be order of n. So it could be like something like, even if you say order of, even if it's order of root n, it hardly makes any difference. The 1000-digit number the order will be a 500-digit number. So if r is a 500-digit number, if the period is a 500-digit number, so I compute f of 0, f of 1, f of 2, f of 3, and by the time I get to f of the 500-digit number, it will be billions of years. So you notice that when the order is very large, it is indeed difficult to find it, or when the period is very large, nobody knows how to find the period of function if the period is extremely large, because if it is small, you can just brute force it and search it off. If it is large and you have no information about the period, just that you are given the function and you know that it is periodic, but then how many times you will evaluate it to find the period? So if the period is very large, it gets very tricky, and quantum mechanics will help us here to compute the period of this periodic function. So that is where we are going to get in quantum mechanics. Now, how do we know that quantum mechanics will help, and how does it help? Is by understanding the principle of quantum superposition and setting up a periodic superposition such that the amplitudes are not zero exactly at the period of that f, and proceeding further from there is the idea, for which we need to know some quantum mechanics. I'll give you a quick introduction to quantum mechanics, though many of you might have got sufficient introduction from previous lectures in this FDP itself, but nevertheless, like nothing wrong in quickly looking at that, say looking at quantum mechanics in the perspective of understanding superposition in a way that it is suitable for us to set up the superposition. So let us see quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is a mathematical model for reality, and the need for a bizarre model of mathematics not seen erstwhile till that time is because of the bizarre nature of the world itself. So how do we know that the world is in, at least in the quantum scale, is bizarre? So you conduct some experiments, you will quickly see that classical thinking and classical style of mathematical physics does not explain or even model what is experimentally visible in the quantum scale. and therefore new kind of mathematics is necessary, and that new kind of mathematics is what we call quantum mechanics today. So I'll just begin with one experiment, the three polarizers experiment. I'll give you the experimental outcome. It will be so bizarre that you may not believe. So I have a link to the YouTube video, so we can possibly see the video also. And once we see that, we'll look at why it is bizarre, and then we'll try to come up with a mathematical model which will explain or predict outcomes of such experiment, and give a name to that model, and the name is quantum mechanics. So let's see the experiment. So the experiment is follows. There is a light source and there is a screen. If you have a horizontal polarizer A, then about 50% of the intensity is what is visible on the screen. If you have a horizontal polarizer A followed by a vertical polarizer C, then there is no photons passing through. Whereas if you have a horizontal polarizer A followed by a 45-degree polarizer B, in turn followed by the vertical polarizer C, then about one eighth of the intensity is visible on the screen. All right. So what is bizarre about this? I mean, nothing can get more bizarre than this, because in the classical style of thinking, if two filters can block the flow of any commodity, then a third filter in between the two cannot reignite the flow. So, for instance, you have milk, and milk is flowing, and you put one filter A and then another filter C, milk stops flowing. You put a third filter, milk will not start flowing again, because if A and C is enough to block the flow of milk, A, B, and C will surely be enough to block. So world is usually monotone. Which world? The world we think is real, the classical world, is all monotone wherever we see. If A and C can do the job, A, B, and C can surely do the job, because B need not do anything. A and C have already done the job. So if water is flowing, dam A and dam C can block the flow of the river water. You construct another dam B that is not going to reignite the flow. If A and C are sufficient to stop the river, A, B, and C is more than sufficient to stop the river, because, as I said, life appears to be monotone, in the sense there is no negative effects that can be there by B. It's usually that if two filters can stop, then the third filter is more than likely to be helping them to stop the flow. So it's never even heard that things can be non-monotone in the real world, because it is not. So information also is monotone in real world. So if A can give you some information, C can give you further information. B, when gives, it cannot delete the information given by A and C. It can only add to it. Maybe B gives no information, but it cannot be that B can have a negative effect in the whole thing. It's all monotone in the real world. So even in the information world. However, in the quantum scale, non-monotone effects have been actually noted experimentally, to the extent that you cannot use classical thinking to model quantum world. So how do we know that we have seen this? This is the YouTube recording of an experiment. So you can see that your eyes is this screen. So you can see for yourself. So horizontal followed by vertical, no light passes through. So watch carefully when it's placing in between these two. So this is how light behaves. This is reality. Nobody can change this. trying with same. Okay. So not only this, they found similar experiments with electrons and in the electron case with electron spin, Stern-Gerlach experiment and so on. So we need a mathematical model which can actually predict the outcome of not only the three polarized experiment with photons, but also in with electron spin in the electron case and so on. And people have postulated one such mathematical model, and that is called quantum mechanics. And let us understand what quantum mechanics is and how it explains or predicts the outcome of this experiment, namely the three polarized experiment, and it also predicts the outcome correctly of all experiments conducted so far. And to the extent that we believe that the postulates are true, and if the postulates are true, then it also predicts the existence of quantum computers, and that's where things get really intriguing. Let's look at the postulates. So it says you can model nature as as a state vector in Hilbert space. That is, you can associate with every reality a state vector in Hilbert space, and one way to view that is it is in superposition of all possible outcomes before you measure. For instance, if there are only two possible outcomes, like in our case, it is either passes through or does not pass through, we call that as a qubit, and it is a state vector in C square. So a qubit is like a times 0 possibility plus b times 1 possibility, where a and b are complex numbers, where mod a square plus mod b square is 1. Before you measure it, it could be in 0 or it could be in 1, and it's in actually it can neither be in 0 nor in 1. There people can use various rhetoric, because in English there is no way of saying that it is in both 0 and 1, whereas quantum superposition is that it is just nothing but a state vector in C square. It is a comma b, that is a times 0 plus b times 1, with the interpretation that if you measure a0 plus b1 with probability of mod a square, you will get the answer 0, and the state will then collapse to 0. With a probability of mod b square, you will get 1, and the state will then collapse to 1, right? So notice that using just this, the first postulate is associated with the quantum system is a state vector in Hilbert space. Second postulate is the amplitude mod square will give you the probability distribution, and if you sample according to that, you will one of the indices which you get as the actual answer. If you measure it, it will collapse consistent with the measurement. So that is the second postulate. With this alone, we can understand and predict the outcomes of the experiment we have seen so far. And of course, the only equation or only a postulate will be missing out is the evolution postulate, which says left alone it will evolve as per Schrodinger equation. But let us use this level of quantum mechanics to understand and predict how it works for the case of the three polarized experiment. So before doing that, so we'll reiterate what the principle is. So if a quantum system can be in many states, then any linear superposition of those states is the reality. So that is what. So for instance, if electron can be in ground state or it can be in excited state, then the superposition of this is what it is before you actually measure. If you measure, there is a possibility of alpha naught square that it will be in ground state, a possibility of mod alpha 1 square that it will be in excited state. And once you measure it and you get this ground state, it collapses to ground state. Once you get the answer as excited state, it collapses to being an excited state. Collapses means it becomes like 1 times 0 plus 0 times 1. So how does this help us in understanding the experiment? So notice that if you measure, the measurement will be according to the samples of the modulus square probabilities of the complex amplitudes, and of course it will collapse to that. So this is what it is. So how do we know that the qubit model is predicting our outcome in the experiment? So initially it is this photon is a times passing through horizontal and b times not passing through horizontal. So that is vertical, right? So it is a times 0 plus b times a times horizontal plus b times vertical. So horizontal could be modeled as 0, vertical as 1, no issue. It's a times passing through horizontal plus b times passing through vertical. Now what is the probability that it will pass through horizontal? Mod a square. Now what is the expected value of mod a square? Now if n be are randomly chosen such that mod a square plus mod b square is 1, then expected value of mod a square is half. And therefore about 50% of the photon should pass through a horizontal polarizer, and that's why 50% intensity drop was there. Okay, next, once it passes through the horizontal polarizer, it collapses to being horizontally polarized, so it will become 1 times horizontal plus 0 times vertical, right? Now if you ask what is the probability that it will pass through vertical, it says 0, and therefore if after passing through horizontal polarizer, the probability that it will pass through vertical polarizer orthogonal to that is 0. Good. So it predicts that horizontal polarizer followed by a vertical polarizer, for we can block all photons. Now if I have a third 45-degree polarizer, we'll see what happens. So it is a times passing through horizontal and b times not passing through. So mod a square. So with probability half, it will pass through horizontal and it will collapse to horizontal. Now what is the probability that the horizontally polarized light will pass through 45-degree polarizer? So horizontal polarizer can be written as 1 by root 2 times 45 plus 1 by root 2 times the orthogonal vector 135. Therefore, the probability that according to quantum mechanics that a horizontally polarized light will pass through a 45-degree polarizer is 1 by root 2 square. Why? Because horizontal is nothing but so there are two possibilities here. It will pass through 45 or not pass through 45. So a horizontal polarized light can be written as 1 by root 2 times 45 and 1 by root 2 times 135. So the probability according to quantum mechanics that a horizontally polarized light will pass through 45-degree polarizer is 1 by root 2 square, that is half. And once it passes through that, it collapses to 45-degree polarized light. So that's what it is. So once it collapses to 45-degree polarized light, what is the probability that a 45-degree polarized light will pass through vertical polarizer? Now 45-degree polarized light can be written as 1 by root 2 times vertical plus 1 by root 2 times horizontal. And therefore 1 by root 2 square is half, and therefore with another 50% chance, a 45-degree polarized light will pass through vertical polarizer. And therefore quantum mechanics predicts that about 1/8 of the photons should pass through the system of horizontal polarizer followed by 45-degree polarizer followed by a vertical polarizer, and that is exactly matching the experimental outcome. Now you can do the experiments at various angles, and quantum mechanics will exactly predict what the intensity will be, because you just have to see that how to write using the trigonometry of cos theta and sin theta, how to actually write the components of what is the possibility that some angle theta will pass through some other angle theta. That's the word, or theta dash. So quantum mechanics is able to predict all these outcomes of all the experiments conducted so far. I have written they have predicted several other experiments too. And the point is that not several, all. There is no contradictory experiment conducted thus far. That will be a big news. So if you say that you are violating the theory, then theory is surely wrong, because if you're what nature says is right, experiments will be the guiding light any day. Given that no counter experiments contradictory experimental results are known, people believe that quantum mechanics is correct. And if you believe quantum mechanics is correct, then we are saying that if you have some possible outcomes, then before measuring them, a linear superposition of all these outcomes is the reality, and the amplitude will be such that the mod of the amplitude square will give you the probability distributions. All right, so using this alone we can establish a secret key is a detour for us. We included this for the following reason. We are breaking RSA, and therefore cryptographers would not be able to use RSA for secure communication. However, quantum mechanics not only helps break stuff, it also helps make stuff. So to give that making or good connotation, we have added one slide to say that using this superposition principle and the no cloning, it's possible to do the BB84 protocol. I will not go into detail of this protocol because as I see, there are other lectures specifically dedicated for this, and therefore you will get full-fledged information about this from other lectures in this FDP itself. So there is no need to harp or spend a lot of time on the BB84 protocol. But notice that you could quickly understand that not just secure communication, you can do wonders if the man in the middle can be detected, because quantum mechanics says if I send vertically polarized light and you try to receive it with horizontal polarizer, nothing should come. If something comes, surely I have found out that somebody else is there in the middle, and that fact that somebody in the middle can actually be detected is a boon, because in the classical world the man in the middle can always buffer whatever data you sent and replay it to you. You will never come to know that there is somebody in the middle. So in the quantum world, the fact that buffering is actually not possible, and also the fact that you can detect the presence of eavesdropper in between Alice and Bob helps cryptography a lot. And one such is the BB84 protocol. You can just encode 0 as vertical polarizer or as 45-degree polarized light. You can encode 1 as horizontally polarized light or the orthogonal to 45. Keep sending zeros and ones encoded this way, and then after the recipient measures all of these, you can just do the following. We know that if the sender and receiver use the same basis, so if I send 0 as vertical and you receive it as vertical, it will be 0. If you receive it as horizontal, it will not receive, and therefore you know it is 0, right? Because if it is horizontal, 0 should not be received, and if it is vertical, 0 should be received, or the photon should be received. So notice that if you use the same basis, the information content at both ends will be the same. You send a 0, he will receive a 0. You send a 1, he will receive a 1. Whereas if you use different bases, this need not be the same, but you can always publish the basis used later on and only look at those instances where the basis used for sender and receiver is the same. Then you know or expect that about what you sent and what you received will exactly match. However, if the eavesdropper is there and the eavesdropper used a different basis to measure in the middle, then notice that there is trouble. There will be sometimes 0 can be received as 1. Why? Because 0 is vertically polarized light. It's quite possible that the eavesdropper measured it as 45 degrees and it collapsed to 45, and we saw that there is 50% chance that 45 can be received as horizontal, which will be read as 1. Therefore, even though both of them used basis B1, if eavesdropper used basis B2, there is a 50% chance that it will be a mistake. But there is, what is the chance that eavesdropper will use B2? If you say that is also 50%, then there is 25% chance, because if eavesdropper also used B1, then there's no change. So there is 50% chance that eavesdropper will use the same, 50% chance that eavesdropper will use the different basis, and if eavesdropper use a different basis, there is 50% chance of a flip. Therefore, overall, we expect a 25% chance of a flip. Whereas if the basis is same and eavesdropper is not there, there is no chance of a flip unless there is noise, which we will not consider for now. Thus, there is easy to differentiate whether eavesdropper is there or not there based on the fact that whether we are matching near to 100% or we are matching near to 75%. We can just publish some randomly chosen bits and check whether they are matching or not. So if the match is close to 75%, then we expect eavesdropper is there. And if match is close to 100%, we expect eavesdropper is not there. Now, if it is true that eavesdropper is not there, then the things that you have not yet published becomes the secret key. You can extract some part of it and use it as the key. Good. All right. So from where does the prediction of quantum computing and quantum parallelism and massive advantage in for computing come into being? So notice that if we say that before you measure, if there are some possible outcomes, then a superposition of all these possible outcomes is the reality, and you can actually have complex amplitudes to actually encode the probabilities. That is a mod of the amplitude square gives you the probability that you'll get that particular answer or that particular output. Then there appears to be exponential bookkeeping by nature, and let us see why. If there is one qubit, that is it is either passing through or not passing through, or it is in ground state or in excited state, or it's electron spin up or spin down, right? Now if there are two such qubits, then the first qubit can be 0 or 1, second qubit can be 0 or 1, and therefore there are 4 possible outcomes, and therefore to describe a 2 qubit system you need 4 complex numbers because there are 4 possible outcomes, and quantum mechanics says before you measure the system a superposition of all these 4 is possible. So you have to say A00 plus B01 plus C10 plus D11, where A, B, C, D are complex numbers normalized in such a way that mod A square plus mod B square plus mod C square plus mod D square is 1, with the physical interpretation that if you measure the system, you get 0, 0 with probability mod A square, you will get 0, 1 with probability mod B square, you get 0, 1, 0 with probability mod C square, and 1, 1 with probability mod D square. Now notice that if I have a 3 qubit system, that is I have 3 hydrogen atoms, and each electron in each of the hydrogen atoms could be in excited state or ground state, then there are 8 possible outcomes. It could be 0, 0, 0 or 0, 0, 1 or 0, 1, 0 or dot 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 1, 1, 1, right? Because there are 2 possibilities, 2 possible outcomes for each electron, and there are 3 electrons, and therefore there are 8 possible outcomes. So quantum mechanics therefore says that before you measure the system, you need 8 complex numbers to describe the system, and that will give us the probability distribution of all these 8 possible outcomes. Now suppose I have a n qubit system, that is I have n hydrogen atoms, and each of the electron in each of the atoms can be either in excited state or ground state. There are 2 power n possible outcomes, and quantum mechanics says before you measure, superposition of all these 2 power n possible outcomes is the reality, and therefore you need to actually have 2 power n complex numbers to describe the system. And here is where Feynman said, therefore it appears that nature is bookkeeping exponential number of complex amplitudes to work according to its quantum mechanics. So if you take say 1 mole of hydrogen, so 6.023 into 10 to the power 23 electrons are there in that. Each of the electron can be in either ground state or excited state, let us say, or spin up or spin down, whatever you want. How many complex numbers are required to describe the system? According to quantum mechanics, you need 2 to the power 6.022 into 10 to the power 23. There's 2 to the power 10 to the power 23 complex numbers to describe the system. That many complex numbers are being stored in that small a volume. Now if that is the case, then we know that to store 2 to the power 10 to the power 23 complex numbers, all the space that is there in the known observable universe is not enough. We know that for the classical world, whereas what we are saying is nature seems to be actually bookkeeping, not just bookkeeping, even computing, but to begin with, we know that it is at least storing 2 to the power 10 to the power 23 complex numbers in the space of just 1 mole of hydrogen. So that is in such a small volume you are able to dump in so much information. So that is massive parallelism in terms of storage. Now what the third postulate says is it will evolve as per Schrödinger equation. That makes things even more interesting. For instance, before we go into quantum computing using that postulate, let us look at quantum entanglement. In the slide, this is what is there. So which gives us even more bizarre view of what is possible using quantum mechanics. Now, if you say that, say, in a multi-qubit system, you can measure some part of the qubits, which is true, because if you have say 2 electrons, say each one has 2 possible outcomes, and therefore 4 possible outcomes. But if I synthesize a system where out of the 4 only 2 are possible, other 2 amplitudes are 0, so I would say it's 1 by root 2 times 0 0 plus 1 by root 2 times 1 1. That's the Bell state. So it's 50% chance that it is spin up up, 50% chance that it is spin down down for the 2 electrons. Now, and if I measure only the first electron, you notice that there is a spooky action at a distance no matter where the other electron is. You measure this, the collapse postulate says it will collapse to 0 0, and therefore the other outcome will have to be 0 no matter where the other electron is. So if I synthesize 2 electrons which are in this state on Earth, and one of them I take it to Mars, I measure say the electron on Earth and get ground state, say 0, then I am sure that the electron on Mars is already collapsed to 0. Even though light takes 2 minutes to reach from Earth to Mars, quantum mechanics does not actually give any heed to that. It turns out that much before that, in fact, perhaps instantaneously, we do not know, as soon as the collapse happens on Earth, it also happens on Mars, and it could happen if the electron was even far beyond Mars. If it was in other side of the universe also, you actually make a collapse outside, say on Earth, then the wherever is the other electron, the collapse happens, and this leads to very bizarre situations. If the other electron goes inside a black hole, what happens? And other things leads to paradoxes which have not yet been resolved. So this is big time messy waters. This information paradox in physics is still not resolved, and it's creating a lot of trouble. And that is because anyway quantum mechanics and gravity have not been put together in any case. So there's no wonder that even from the information angle, nothing much is actually being ironed out. It is all in a mess as of now. However, with respect to computation, you can see that even though quantum mechanics is not fully understood with respect to entanglement inside a black hole versus outside and all those bizarre settings, with respect to the classical simple flat space-time situation, there is a prediction of massive parallelism, because the entire system evolves as per Schrodinger equation, and that is the third postulate, the evolution postulate. So that way we can understand quantum mechanics by just the 3 postulates, right? So first postulate is associated with any quantum system is a state vector in Hilbert space. Second postulate, if you measure it, you will get the outcomes as per the mod square of the amplitudes in the state vector, and there is a collapse. And then left alone, the state vector is going to be transformed as per Schrodinger equation, or in matrix mechanics, you can say the state vector is going to be multiplied by some unitary transformation, some unitary matrix. So notice that if that is what is the situation, then if in an n qubit system there are 2 power n possible states, so the system is in superposition of all these 2 power n. You need 2 power n complex amplitudes alphas to describe it. You could, in principle, apply the unitary transformation to this n qubits and simultaneously get the entire superposition transform. And what would this entail? Notice that in a standard n-bit input, there are only 2 power n possible rows in the truth table, because there are only 2 power possible inputs. So if I have a superposition of all possible inputs, and that's what we have. If you have an n-qubit system, you have superposition of all possible inputs. And I run a quantum program, it's natural to believe that you will get a superposition of all possible outputs, and that is what is the massive quantum parallelism which comes to use when you are working with quantum computation. You can actually run your program on all possible inputs in one go. So it is like a single instruction multiple data system. One instruction you can do it on all the 2 4 data and get a superposition of all possible outputs. Of course, if you measure, you still get only one output, and that is where we can see that even though there is massive parallelism for nature to use, for humans and for man, there is still you have to collapse it to only one possible outcome, and therefore you need very interesting and intelligent algorithms to actually start using this massive parallelism. And the fact that the unitary transformations are linear, because unitary means multiply by unitary matrix. Multiplying by matrix itself is linear. Unitary matrix is a special kind of a matrix. So what is a unitary matrix? So it is a matrix of complex numbers such that the inverse of the matrix should be the conjugate transpose. Then we say it is unitary. So according to Schrödinger equation, left alone, the state vectors will only transform in a unitary way. That is, they will only rotate. They will not elongate, right? So you can rotate the vector, and that is because you may actually view the vector from various angles. So there is a natural way in which you can rotate anyway. So only unitary transformations are allowed. So you have a unitary transformation, and if you have an initial system which is set of all possible inputs, and I have an output register that is initialized to 0. If I apply the unitary transformation, you can quickly see by linearity that you will get the superposition of all possible outputs from summation of x and 0 for all possible x, all the 2 power n possible values of x, where x is n bits. I will get to summation of x comma f of x, where I'll get the superposition of all possible outputs. So for x is 0 to 2 power n minus 1, I'll get x comma f of x. So by single transformation, I am able to compute the function on all possible 2 power n possibilities of x. So you are able to do exponentially massive parallel computation where x can be taken to f of x for all possible values of x. Now, how do you get all possible values from the superposition of outputs? How do you get all these things? You can't get. You can, if you measure it, you will get only for one value of x, and that's where quantum computing becomes tricky. But we'll see that with respect to our problem of finding the period of the function, it's not necessary to worry about a particular x. You can get any x and you're happy with it. So if you want to find the period of a function, then if I take all possible x and take a superposition of all possible f of x, that itself solves a majority of our main problems. We don't need to worry about the fact that if I measure it, I will get only one value. It is good enough if you actually get for any value. But before understanding that, let us see how do you set up the superposition such for such that the amplitudes are periodic. That is, we want to compute the period of the function f of a, which is x power a mod n. Recall that's where we stopped our thread for the integer factorization algorithm. If you recall, we said integer factorization. First, we reduce it to computing the non-trivial square roots of unity, the modulo n. Then we reduce that further to computing the order of a random x, and if the order turns out to be even, we are done. We just have to do x power r by 2 and get the non-trivial square root of unity. Third step is to realize that to get the order of a function, order of x, we were able to create a function f such that the period of the function is a periodic function. Period of the periodic function is nothing but the order of x that you want. First step, how do you get the period? So we are saying we can set up a quantum superposition which involves 2 power n amplitudes, all right, but these amplitudes are non-zero only in periodic locations with a period r. And how do we do the setup? So you just do the following. Take all possible A's and apply your unitary transformation and get a superposition of all possible f of A's. So that's what I have given here. Then you measure the second register. If you measure the second register and get an answer, what does the collapse postulate say? The entire system will collapse consistent with the answer. And what do you mean consistent with the answer? The second register will collapse to some value b, let us say. So f of A is b. So whenever f of A is b, those amplitudes will be non-zero, and whenever f of A is not b, those amplitudes will become zero, because you already measured the second register to be some value b. Now if f of A is b, then we know f of A plus r is also b, because f is periodic with a period r. So f of A plus 2r is also b, and therefore for some A, it will, if the amplitude remains non-zero because f of A is b, then f of A plus r will also be b, f of A plus 2r also will be, those amplitudes also will be non-zero, the rest of all will become zero. And therefore to set up a periodic superposition where the amplitudes are non-zero with a period r, and that r is exactly the period of the function f that you're looking for, which in turn is exactly the order of x that you're looking for, all you have to do is first take an n-qubit system, apply your Walsh-Hadamard transform to get a superposition of all possible inputs, apply your function f there, you'll get superposition of all possible outputs, measure the output, you'll get some output, but at that point the system would have collapsed to the superposition of A plus r, A plus 2r, A plus 3r for some offset A and the period r. So all you're left now is you got a superposition where the amplitudes are non-zero according to some periodic function. Your job is now to just compute that period r. Now if the offset was 0, then things are very easy. That is, if A was 0, things are easy, because f of 0, f of r, f of 2r, so only at multiples of r it will be non-zero. So I just measure it, I'll get the index A, I'll measure the first register, I'll get some index A which is non-zero. That will be a multiple of r. I do this multiple times, take GCD, I'll get r. However, notice that each time I may get a different B, and therefore the offset A could be different each time. So the r will be the same because the period of f is same, because x is not changed. But then when you measure f of second register and get f of A is b, that b can be b, b dash, b double dash. Each time you measure, I'll get different answer, and therefore the offset A will be different. So I'll what do you mean by the offset A? So f of A is the b, so I could get A plus r, A plus 2r, A plus 3r dot 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 first time, A dash plus r, A dash plus 2r, A dash plus 3r dot 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 second time, A double dash A double dash plus r, A double dash plus 2r. So this could be the time. So first time I measure I'll get some A plus some multiple of r. Second time I measure, I'll get A dash plus multiple of r. Third time I measure, I'll get A double dash plus multiple of r. With this, because I don't have any idea of what that A dash, A double dash is, this I don't know what to do. So at this point, Peter Shor came up with a very interesting situation. So this is just an example of how do you get this period of the superposition. So the final step is, once you get to this position where you can actually get the superposition in a periodic amplitudes, and you just need to find the period. Peter Shor said you should remove the offset. If the offset is removed, then automatically if I start measuring, I will get some multiple of the period, because the amplitudes are non-zero only at the multiple of the period if the offset is 0. And I can do this setup multiple times and keep getting multiple indices which are multiples of the period, and take GCD and get the period. How do you make the offset 0? So for that, he noticed that if you do a discrete Fourier transform of a periodic function with some offset A and period r, if you do a discrete Fourier transform, you will get another periodic function with period n by r, but offset will be 0, and that is exactly what you are looking for. So step 4 is to do a Fourier transform of your superposition, which is a periodic superposition, and your job is to find the period there. A Fourier transform of a periodic function is also a periodic function, but the period will become the the original frequency will become the wavelength will become frequency, right? So here in this our case period will become n by r rather than r. However, if you can compute n by r, you can compute r from that because you know n anyway, and therefore step 4 is to do a Fourier transform of the periodic vector that you have. You will get another periodic vector which will have a different period. It will be n by the original period. Now, if original period does not exactly divide n, then also it will be the period will be very close to n by r. So no problem there. So if you apply Fourier transform and the offset disappears and you keep now measuring. So for instance, if you say apply Fourier transform and find approximately it becomes periodic, and you can find the period now by measuring it different times and then taking the GCD. So for instance, so I have changed the n to m here because the total qubits is like exact power of 2. N need not have been exact power of 2, so you may have to go to a m which is larger than n, but it's not exact power of 2. So that is the reason. So suppose we set up a system, take the Fourier transform, measure it, you will get an index. The index will be very close to some multiple of m by k. Now what is k? K is your period that you are looking for. M is the total number of possibilities, which will be exact power of 2 in our case, whereas n need not have exact power of 2, but that does not matter. We can take a m which is larger than n, it will still work. Notice that if you have m amplitudes, I just need log m qubit system to get m amplitudes. Say all the 2 power n cases indices are there in superposition. It is non-zero only at some points. So I need to find what that point. I take the quantum Fourier transform. I take the Fourier transform, let us say. The period now becomes m by k, but I can find out what this m by k is by measuring this multiple times. Each time I'll get a multiple of m by k. So if I take the GCD of all this with very high probability, I can prove that it will be m by k, the answer, because some multiple j1 times m by k, another multiple j2 times m by k, another multiple j3 times m by k, dot. GCD of all this, what is the probability that you will get m by k? Very high. So that is a proof that you need to give, which is there in the literature. We are not doing it in the slides now, but notice that we can think of a situation where if you repeat it logarithmically many times, so if you have n, so even repeat it s log n, x is equal to log n times, and take the GCD of this log n times, you will get the answer. So at this point you can see that all that is left is the following. So once you set up your superposition, you take a quantum Fourier transform, or take a Fourier transform, and you measure, then set up the superposition again similarly and take Fourier transform and measure. Each time you measure, you will get a multiple of m by k, and from that you will get value of m by k. Since you know m, from that you can get k, and k is the period, and therefore all that is to note is that the most complicated step there is to take the Fourier transform of the superposition. Now if I am able to give an efficient algorithm for Fourier transform, we are done. Now unfortunately in the classical world, Fourier transform of a vector cannot be done in logarithmic time. So whereas in the quantum world, we'll show how to do that. So let us understand the non-quantum world for Fourier transform first and see why even the best known algorithm for Fourier transform, that is the fast Fourier transform algorithm, does not suffice to do the problem of integer factorization this way, because taking Fourier transform of a vector, there is no very fast method. For instance, if the fastest known method for finding Fourier transform vector of size n takes n log n time. Now here n for us is exponential because our n is like 1000-bit number, so 2 power 1000. So 2 power 1000 into log 2 power 1000 is 1000 times 2 power 1000. That is still worse. So you see that even the fastest algorithms for Fourier transform do not actually work. However, we'll still understand Fourier transform and the fast Fourier transform algorithm because it is based on divide and conquer and recursion. And if you can use quantum computing to superpose that recursion, it turns out that rather than doing it in n log n, you can do it in log square n. And that becomes very fast because 2 power 1000, so log 2 power 1000 square is just 1 million. And that is an efficient algorithm. So it's efficient in log n. So it is quadratic in log n. So log square n is quadratic in log n, whereas n log n is exponential in log n, right? So quantum Fourier transform gives a quantum algorithm for Fourier transform in log square n, whereas a fast Fourier transform will do it in n log n. Now to understand the quantum Fourier transform, what we will do is first understand the fast Fourier transform algorithm and then quickly see that if you just superpose the recursion, you will get your quantum Fourier transform. So let us spend some time in understanding the fast Fourier transform. How do you understand fast Fourier transform? One way to do that will be to write the discrete Fourier transform matrix and try to give an algorithm for discrete Fourier transform. We will not do that. We will take a seemingly unrelated problem and then show how fast Fourier transform emerges from that problem directly. And the problem we will look for is the following. Given two d-degree polynomials, compute their product. Give me a very fast algorithm for this. Of course, we know of standard algorithms. For instance, if A is a d-degree polynomial and B is another d-degree polynomial, the product is a 2 d-degree polynomial, and we know how to get the coefficients by the convolution of this formula. So we have a formula for the kth coefficient Ck. To compute Ck, you need to do summation over I equal to 0 to k a into bk minus a. So it takes quadratic time to compute each of the coefficients, and you have to compute order d coefficients. So it's a d square algorithm. So order d square algorithm is there. To compute the product of two d-degree polynomials, you can do it in d square. However, question is, if you apply this formula directly, you get a d square algorithm. Question is, can we do better than d square? Answer is yes. You can do it in d log n, d log d, and that gives us the fast Fourier transformation algorithm actually. So how can you do product of two polynomials in order d log d and not d square? You have to compute order d coefficients of the answer, and to compute each coefficient it takes order d steps. So should it not be d square? Answer is you can do divide and conquer and actually do in d log d, and let us see how it works. So the idea is the following. You are given the coefficients of polynomial A, you are given the coefficients of polynomial B, and you want the coefficients of the product. If from the coefficients, if you want to multiply, it's a d square algorithm. However, we can say that a polynomial can be represented by the coefficients. A polynomial can also be represented by points on the polynomial. So if there are sufficiently many points on the polynomial, you can uniquely represent the polynomial, and that's called the value representation. For instance, polynomial A can be represented using coefficients a0 to ad. It's a d-degree polynomial. Polynomial A can also be represented by giving you the values of a of x0, a of x1, a of x2, dot, 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 a of xd for d plus 1 different values of d. That is another way to represent the polynomial. Now this value representation, as we call it, is very useful for multiplication. Let us see why. It may be difficult to multiply in linear time for the coefficient representation, whereas in the value representation, if I give you two polynomials in value representation, that is, if I give you a of x0, a of x1, dot, dot, of a of xd, and b of x0, b of x1, dot, dot, of b of xd, and ask you for the value representation of the product. Ask you for what is C of x naught, C of x1, C of xt, where C is the product of A and B. You can quickly see that this is a very easy thing because C of x naught is nothing but A of x naught into B of x naught. If C is A into B, and what is if C is to, I have to find what will C evaluate when on at x naught, it is nothing but what will A evaluate at x naught into what will B evaluate at x naught. And therefore, in the value representation, I have a linear time algorithm. By just doing order D multiplications, I can multiply two polynomials in value representation. So with respect to the operation of multiplication, value representation is the best. However, you have been given quotient representation. Therefore, what can be done is you can think of an algorithm which does the following. Given the quotient representation, it converts it to value representation, multiplies in the values representation, and then converts it back to quotient representation. Now, converting coefficients to values is called evaluation, and converting from the points to the coefficients is called interpolation. And therefore, what we can do is evaluate, multiply, interpolate, and that will give us the first cut solution for this problem. Now, where does fast Fourier transform come in? We'll come shortly to that. The first cut solution is you want to find the product of two polynomials A and B. Pick some points x0, x1, x2, some n where n should be at least 2d plus 1 because answer is 2d degree polynomial and you need to interpolate at least 2d plus 1 points to get the quotients. So pick some large enough n. Pick n different points. Evaluate the polynomial A on all the endpoints, evaluate the polynomial B on the same endpoints, then multiply those and you will get the points on the polynomial C, which is the product. Then interpolate and get the coefficients of C. Now in this, notice that in this first cut solution, selection is fairly straightforward, it's a linear time. Multiplication also has become straightforward, linear time. Evaluation and interpolation are 3 steps. How do you evaluate a polynomial at a point? So that itself looks like takes linear time and you have to evaluate at linear number of points. So evaluation seems to be taking n square, which is order d square anyway. So, so it does not seem to help to going this way because evaluation itself is order d square. Interpolation could be even worse. So it is even though selection and multiplication are linear, evaluation and interpolation are not making things easy. And now we'll see that even though evaluation in general appears to be d square and interpolation could be even worse, if you choose the points on the polynomial instead of random points x0, x1, if you choose x0, x1, x2 to be some specifically chosen points, then you can compute A of x0, A of x1 and B of x0, B of x1 in d log d rather than d square. And then you can also interpolate in d log d and overall you will get the fast Fourier transform algorithm. And that algorithm, when I remove the recursion and superpose the recursion, it becomes a quantum Fourier transform algorithm. So how do you evaluate our FFT with divide and conquer? So you split the d degree polynomial into two d by 2 degree polynomials, that is odd and even powers. For instance, A of x can be written as all the even powers evaluated at x square plus x times all the odd powers evaluated at x square. So for instance, if A of x is a polynomial 5 plus 2x plus 6x square plus 3x cube plus 7x power 4 plus 8x power 5, I can take only the odd powers separately as AO, that is 2 plus 3x plus 8x square. That is, I'm taking the coefficients of x cube and x power 5 and writing them as a polynomial of degree 2. And I am writing another polynomial looking at only even powers and writing them again as a polynomial of degree 2. So basically you can split the polynomial of degree d into two polynomials of degree roughly d by 2. And also notice that A of x can now be written as AE of x square plus x times AO of x square, because A of x can be written as 5 plus 6x square plus 7x power 4 plus 2x plus 3x cube plus 8x power 5. That is nothing but AE evaluated at x square plus x times AO evaluated at x square. Now, how does this help us? Advantage is, if I am able to evaluate AE and AO at xi square, then I can quickly get A evaluated at 2 points and not 1. By evaluating AE and AO at point xi square, I can get A evaluated at both xi and minus xi. Why? Because A of x is nothing but AE of x square plus x times AO of x square. Therefore, A of minus x will be again A of x square minus x times A of x square. So if I know the values of AE of x square and AO of x square, I can quickly get what is the value of A of x as well as A of minus x. And notice that we got a big advantage here. A of x is evaluated at 2 points by using just 2 evaluations of half the degree, and that is what is divide and conquer. So you want to solve T of n, what you are doing is you are saying T of n is nothing but 2 times T of n by 2 plus some order n, and that will give you n log n. Great. But is there a problem here? The problem is I can continue the recursion only if, so notice that I got A of x and A of minus x, right, by evaluating xi square. Now if I want this recursion to continue, right, if it continues I will get n log n, all right. If it continues I will get n log n, all right. But if I want this to continue, there's a big problem. A of x naught and A of minus x naught I got by evaluating AE and AO at x square. Similarly, A of x1 and minus x1 I will get it at evaluating AE and AO at x1 square. But if recursion has to continue, x naught square and x1 square also should be plus minus pairs, because only then I can continue the recursion. I want x naught square and x1 square to be plus minus pairs. That is, x1 square should be minus x naught square. Only then I can continue this recursion, because for recursion I got x naught A evaluated at x naught and minus x naught by evaluating AE and AO at x square. Now if I want to get the recursion, I will say to get AE at x naught and x naught square and x1 square, I will evaluate AE and AEO at x naught power 4, right? So something like that. So for that we need x1 square to be minus x naught square, but then we want perfect squares to be plus minus pairs. How will a perfect square be minus? A big problem. How can a square be negative? Because we want the square to be plus minus pairs. Of course, the task is impossible in the real number pairs. What if the complex numbers are allowed to use? You can evaluate. What if you can evaluate polynomials and complex numbers? Of course you can. Square of complex numbers can be negative. Therefore, what you do, which complex numbers to use? We'll quickly see that to evaluate x naught and at x naught and minus x naught, I need to evaluate at x square at half the degree. I want this to be plus minus pair. I want that to be plus minus pair. And finally, if I want to evaluate it at 1, the previous step I would have evaluated at plus and minus 1. The previous step I should have evaluated at plus 1 minus 1 plus I minus I, and so on. So at the top, I will notice that if I do this reverse computation, I want to select the points as nth roots of unity. If I evaluate the polynomial, if I have to evaluate the polynomial at 1 omega square dot omega for n minus 1, then I can actually do it in n log n and not n square. Why? Because I can use divide and conquer and this recursion goes through. So if what you mean by evaluate the points at the polynomial, so this is nothing but a Fourier transform. So evaluating the points, evaluating a polynomial at the nth roots of unity is nothing but called the discrete Fourier transform of the vector. The vector is nothing but the coefficient vector, right? So this results in the following fast Fourier transform algorithm. If I want to evaluate the coefficients A on the polynomials on the values omega or 1 omega square dot omega per n minus 1, I can just say split A into AE and AO, evaluate AE at omega square, evaluate AO at omega square, and compute A of omega power j is AE times omega power 2j plus omega power j times AO plus omega power 2j, and return these values. And this will if you write it in a recursive way, you will see that it is an n log n algorithm because FFT calls FFT twice, and each time it calls it is squared, and therefore by that we'll get a formula of running time is T of n is 2 times T of n by 2 plus order n. So that so FFT is a n log n algorithm. So what about interpolation? It turns out that with respect to the FFT matrix, the interpolation is very similar to evaluation. So amazingly, from coefficients to values, you have to apply FFT. From values to coefficients, you have to apply FFT with omega inverse and divide by n. So how do you prove this? So notice that evaluation of a polynomial is nothing but multiplying with the van der Waals matrix. If your polynomial coefficients are a0, a1, a2, so you multiply with this matrix, you get that. Now this matrix, right? If you take the inverse of this matrix and multiply with the values, you will get this. Now this matrix for discrete Fourier transform is nothing but ith entry, ijth entry is omega power ij, because this is what is meant by evaluating at omega power I, right? Each time. Now the inverse of this particular matrix, it turns out to be 1 by n times m of n omega inverse. This you can check, and therefore by applying FFT again, so you can interpolate. Now we are ready to go. So FFT algorithm is clear. We can now actually see how you can quantize that, because if I want to do FFT, see what we are doing. We are doing recursion with odd even coefficients, and that can be written as put all the coefficients where the least significant bit is 0 and all the coefficients where least significant bit is 1, and then recurs on one part and recurs on the other part. How do we make a superposition of this? So you actually apply a Hadamard gate, which takes 0 to 1 by root 2 superposition of 0 and 1, 1 by root 2 times 0 plus 1, and 1 to 1 by root 2 times 0 minus 1. So if I have a gate which is called the Hadamard gate, which can actually superpose 0 and 1, and if I take a least significant bit and apply H gate there, I'll get a superposition of all the odd and even. Since I got the superposition of all odd and even, I just need to apply my quantum Fourier transform of half the size to the superposition only once. Why? Because it is superposition of odd and even. In the classical world, you are supposed to do FFT of the odd and then FFT of the even and then conquer. In the quantum world, you can do it in superposed space, so I apply only once. So you will get T of n is T of n by 2 plus the overhead. Now this will give you log, because T of n is T of n by 2, not 2 times T of n. T of n is T of n by 2 plus the overhead. You will see that it quickly becomes sublinear. In fact, it will become logarithmic. And also note that how much extra you should do depends on the conquer step. Now how do you conquer? We had to actually do a phase shift. We have to multiply by omega power j. So how do you do a phase shift? If you know how much you have to phase shift beforehand, you can do it in just one single step, just phase shift, multiply by the phase shift matrix. If you do not know beforehand, you create several phase shift matrices which are exact powers of 2. So you can shift by theta, you can shift by 2 theta, 4 theta, 8 theta, 16 theta, I mean all that. Then shifting by any n theta can be written in terms of log n number of shifts based on the binary expansion of the number n in the n theta. I know I need to shift by n theta, I need to shift by 2 theta, 4 theta, 8 theta, and so on. So based on the binary expansion of n, in logarithmic number of shifts, I can complete the entire shift, and that's what gives us the quantum Fourier transform. So it says you apply the Hadamard transform, apply the QFT matrix, and for the QFT, and then conquer it by logarithmic number of shifts. Apply the Hadamard transform again, and continue this. You will get a circuit for quantum Fourier transform, which will run in order log square n and not in n log n. You'll run a log square because you're only applying Fourier transform of half the size only once, and then your overhead is logarithmic number of phase shifts. Therefore, overall will be log square. So this is the essence of the quantum algorithm for the entire process of integer factorization. So I'll just give a brief summary of what you did in this entire session and then open up for questions. So let us put all of this together. You'll get a complete code. So the complete code looks like this. Input is an odd composite integer n. Output is you have to factor n. So what we saw is first step is you have to choose an x uniformly at random in the range 1 to n minus 1. Our job is to compute the order of this x, and if the order of this x is even, then we can do that x power r by 2 and get the non-trivial square root and take GCD of that plus 1 and get finish of the answer. So the first step is choose x uniformly at random in the range 1 to n minus 1. So you take number m, which is the exact power of 2, so that the Fourier transform does not actually fall into trouble, and it is greater than n. Step 3, you keep repeating it 2 log n times. Start with 2 quantum registers, initially 0. Apply your Walsh-Rama transform to get a superposition of all possible a's, and then apply your function f and get superposition of all possible f of a's, and then you measure the second register. It will collapse consistent with your what you measured, and that will be amplitudes will be in a periodic function whose period will be exactly the period of f, which is also nothing but the order of x. Then you do a quantum Fourier transform, right, of this. The offset will go to 0. Then you Fourier sample this. That's what is multiply. Do a Fourier transform and measure. You will get an answer. This answer will be very close to a multiple of m by the r, where r is the order of your x. Take the GCD of all these resultant answers. If this is even, that is if the resultant order is even, so notice that the indices are multiples of m by order, so you have to do GCD of that will be m by the order, and if you do m by the order, you'll get the order. So you do m by the GCD is nothing but the order. So if this m by the GCD is even, it will be the order. Then compute that whole thing by 2 is that's r by 2. X to power r by 2 you do, and do plus 1 and do GCD with n. So this is all we saw already, that x to power even order by 2 mod n is nothing but non-trivial square root. Non-trivial square root plus 1 and GCD with n is a factor. So if m by g is even, then compute the GCD of n and x power m by 2g plus 1 mod n. This output is a non-trivial factor of 1, right? If m by g is odd, for instance, not even, then you repeat. So you repeat again. So choose another x, right? Choose another x and hope that it will be even. A number of times you expect repeat is only twice, because with 50% chance it will be the order will be even. So first time if it's not, mostly second time. Of course, expected is 2. Worst case is infinity. You may always keep choosing r, but then if when the expected is 2, Chernoff bound says by the time you go deviate sufficiently away from 2, the probability that you will have a run which is sufficiently away from 2 reduces exponentially with the distance from the expectation value of 2. Right. So this is the entire code. So I'll stop here for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your encouraging session on that integer factorization. Any questions from the participants? Probably it's a lunch time, and I hope you won't be in an exhaustive state rather. So if you have any queries, you can ask me. You can ask, sorry, our speaker.
There is enough time for the questions. So it's only 120 is schedule time was 140. So anyway, we can close early if there are no questions. No problem.
Yeah, yeah. We have a question from Sachin. Sachin ji.
Yes, sir. Sir, I would like to ask one question. Which hardware we should prefer to actually implement this Shor's algorithm?
So currently Shor's algorithm requires log n qubit system, and when n is 2 power 1000 like RSA, you require a 1000 qubit system, and entanglement of 1000 qubits has not been stably shown in laboratory anywhere in the world. So Shor's algorithm today cannot be implemented for large numbers, because if you had done that, we would have already broken the entire thing that's running in the internet today. People from net banking to e-commerce, everybody uses current public crypto systems which are vulnerable to quantum algorithms, right? So currently the hardware is not suitable. However, the hardware based on NMR or ion trap, or say what IBM and Google are potentially claiming to have already built, is up to something like 16 qubit systems and 20 qubit systems. Google says it got quantum supremacy with 50 qubits and so on. So basically what it means is they are claiming to have the ability to build 50 qubit systems, and therefore have a situation where if your number is a 50-bit number, then this style of algorithm can work in your 50 qubit system. If you go beyond 50, okay, the major problem here is the stability of the system. Nature may have a limit, may not have limit. Current physics does not actually venture into saying anything. In fact, current quantum mechanics predicts that there is no limit. I mean, you can do n qubit systems for as high n as you like, and therefore current quantum mechanics predicts existence of quantum computers for large n qubit systems also. However, the stability and decoherence with the environment being a big problem, people find that you are not able to build quantum registers which are stable for high n. If you want to analyze or realize or understand the challenge, the major difference in the classical world, if I have a 8-bit register and I want to build a 16-bit memory, I just need to put two 8-bit registers together. I'll get a 16-bit register and 16-bit memory, because in classical world it is a Cartesian product, so the dimension just adds. Whereas notice that in the quantum world, if you want a 16 qubit register, notice that we already realized you need 2 power 16 complex numbers to describe a 16 qubit system. Whereas a 8 qubit system can be described using 2 power 8 complex numbers. Therefore, having two 8 qubit registers together does not automatically become a 16 qubit register. Why? Because two 8 qubit registers can be represented by 2 into 2 power 8, that is 2 power 9 complex numbers. Whereas to truly describe a 16 qubit system, you know that you need 2 power 16 complex numbers, and two 8 qubit registers are only as powerful as one 9 qubit register. Whereas to describe a 16 qubit register, you actually need 2 power 8 qubit registers, right? That's the power. Therefore, just because you can build a quantum computer for 8 qubits does not mean that you already built a quantum computer for general purpose any number of qubits, like it does in the classical world. In the classical world, people build a system with say 32-bit word size, and then you say now you move to 64-bit word size. The power of 64-bit word size is only about twice that of 32-bit word size. If I have two 32-bit machines, I can write a software which can simulate a 64-bit word size. Whereas a 64 qubit quantum computer is 2 power 32 times more powerful than a 32 qubit quantum computer. So I need 2 power 32 such quantum computers of smaller size to simulate that, and therefore that is a completely new technology. So that's where what we are saying is currently we are reaching up to some small qubit systems in the market. Going beyond small qubit systems, there is trouble and research is still on, and the trouble could be fundamental also. We do not know. Nature might have placed a limit also on the fact that you cannot cross some n qubit system for some n. We do not know. Therefore, whether this quantum algorithm that Shor gave is actually going to be ever become practical depends on the physics of whether 1024 qubit systems with stability are ever going to be practical or not. So hope that answers your question, Sajid.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have one generic question. This quantum computing programming requires entirely different mindset. So, say if we take one classical problem, how one should attack that particular problem to be solved using a quantum computer?
Okay, so
actually the thought process of the program.
Yes, I understood the question. So think of it this way: quantum computers can only do matrix multiplication. So that is one way to think of it. So it can do unitary matrix multiplication, except that it can do the dimensions of that matrix can be exponential. So I can do a unitary transformation of a vector whose size, the vector's number of elements in the vector could be 2 power n, and the matrix could be 2 power n cross 2 power n. So I can do exponential size matrix multiplication in the quantum world. So that is what it is. So how do you think in the of solving real life problems in quantum? So you should be able to transform the problem into exponential size matrix multiplication. So quantum is linear, so you cannot do beyond unitary matrix multiplication. Quantum cannot do anything. However, it can do exponential times linear multiplication. So notice that even in Shor's algorithm, the quantum Fourier transform is a discrete Fourier transform matrix, except that he is able to give a discrete Fourier transform matrix of exponential size. So for n qubit system, that is 2 power n cross 2 power n size matrix, he is able to do the DFT matrix multiplication, which is unitary, and he is able to do that. So similarly, for every problem, you should be able to see whether that problem can be transformed to a problem of matrix multiplication where the matrix size can be very large. So it can be even exponential size. The quantum computer will do exponential size matrix multiplication as long as the matrix is unitary. It can do unitary exponential size matrix multiplication in a jiffy. So that is the one thing. Second style of attack is Grover style of attack, which will not give exponential speed up, it will give only quadratic speed up. His style is, so if you are able to actually know which indices you are spiking at, you can increase the amplitude of those indices what you are spiking at and reduce the amplitude of others, so that after a sufficient number of such iterations, when you measure, you will get the answer directly. So that is for Grover search algorithms, you do that. So these are basically only two kinds of things. To get exponential speed up, you have to go through this matrix multiplication way. If you want quadratic speed up, you can go through the amplitude expansion way. So these are the two things.
That means, sir, that means the first solution which you are suggesting, we need to take the exponential of the Hamiltonian.
Yes. So that Hamiltonian will be exponential dimension, correct? So 2 power n cross 2 power n. Hamiltonian will be described by 2 power n plus 2 power n matrix. Now your real life problem may not be a matrix multiplication problem at all. For instance, integer factorization was not a matrix multiplication problem, whereas discrete Fourier transform was a matrix multiplication problem, and the entire process is to convert integer factorization to the quantum Fourier transform problem, right? So similarly, you take your real life problem, convert it into a huge matrix multiplication problem, and then bring quantum mechanics. That will work.
Sir, are there any resources which will help us to build up this particular thought process?
Resources, there is a book on quantum computation and information by Nielsen and Zhang.
Yeah, that we'll see. Specifically, I'm asking about a resource which will help us to build up this thought process to convert a classical problem into a quantum problem.
Yeah, so I am not aware of so any such resource, because every such problem that people solve is becoming a research paper. So there is no generic direct approach. So for instance, if you take a new problem and you are able to convert this, you can publish it. So people do not today probably know how to naturally take a problem and convert it this way. It is a research problem. Every single conversion is being considered as a research problem as of today.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir. Sir, I have one small question.
Yes.
What sort of keys are used in quantum cryptography? Like, will it be a secret key and plus something to encode it? What sort of keys are used for quantum cryptography?
So the keys are still classical as of today. You take some classical bits and then encode it using qubits, and then decode it and get back classical bits there. So keys are still classical bits, zeros and ones.
That is, we can have shared key. We can have shared key and qubits
No,
together.
shared key, the key is still classical bits today.
Okay.
To share classical bits, you encode them as qubits, you send the qubits across in optical fiber or whatever, and measure the qubits on the other side, and then do some protocol, and then at the end, Alice and Bob will still have your AES 128-bit key. The key is the same.
Okay, sir.
That is today. But you can think of qubits itself as a key once you actually get protocols which are actually going to use qubits as the key, and the protocol does encryption, which is a quantum computation protocol. So today, that's today's quantum cryptography. The key is still classical. The encryption algorithm is still classical. Only the key exchange process is quantum today. In the future, there could be quantum encryption algorithms where key itself is qubits. No, that is okay. Welcome. That's welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Anybody else want to ask any question? Anybody having any queries? So no queries, I think.
Okay, good news.
So we have still 2 minutes. If we have still 2 minutes left, if you have any queries, you can ask. Okay, probably they will be. They might be feeling hungry right now. Okay, because it's already lunchtime. So thank you so much, Srinath sir, for your wonderful session on quantum computing, especially how to solve a problem using quantum Fourier transform. So it is very interesting, and probably the participants will be benefited from your session. So thanks a lot for joining us. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Namaskar, sir.
So can I leave now?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.